Hey Toji, thanks for
Yeah,
joining. How are
my
you?
pleasure. All well. Looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, same here. I think we've been talking about HRness, talents, synergy, and for quite some time. But I thought, why don't we do a little bit of idea exchange or understand from you
Absolutely.
in terms of the HRness and how we can really add value to the overall people functions, right? And the
Right,
large
right.
people initiatives across organizations. So if I can, take the first jump and
Right.
quickly ask you to help us understand, right, that talent, artificial intelligence, HRness, right? All of this has been part of your journey so far, right? So why don't you help us first quickly
Yeah.
get, where you
Right,
are and, what got you here?
right, right. Sure. So, so I have overall about 19 years experience in a couple of areas. One is talent analytics, then it's product management and talent supply chain.
Right.
And based on the overall experience that I've had with various functional as well as technical areas, specifically around HR tech, I feel that there's a lot of appetite in the talent operations space for using technologies, specifically cutting edge technology like AI, right? But the simple fact remains that while there is an appetite to consume these frameworks and technologies,
Right.
overall there's no readiness, or rather there's a reduced level of readiness to be able to consume these frameworks, right? So if you start with the example of, say, machine learning, right? What's happening right now is, while a lot of talent leaders want to use machine learning and AI, the some of the basic building blocks are not in place. So for example, if you start with just data adequacy to start with, right? Often leaders want to say, okay, let me use machine learning to, say, predict chances of someone leaving, right? So
Mhm.
while the modeling process starts with a lot of fanfare, the fact still remains that when they start looking for input data, there are a lot of critical data points that are missing, right?
Correct.
So
Correct.
the ability for an organization to objectively just sit down and say, okay, are we really there when it comes to implementing machine learning? That's missing, right?
Right.
And so that's point number one. Point number two is, assuming the data is in place, there
Mhm.
still needs to be a lot of awareness among organizations on what data is usable and what isn't, in terms of regulatory compliance, privacy guidelines, etc.
Right.
Right? So these are some of the building blocks that need to be in place before organizations can even think of even starting to use machine learning models. That's one perspective. The other perspective is that, what I've also felt is that even after an organization implements machine learning models,
Mhm.
they often look at machine learning systems as simple software, which is usually deterministic, right? In a
Yeah.
software, you given one input and you expect a certain output. But machine learning models are not like that. They decay over a period of time, and that's an intricacy not many folks realize.
Yeah.
Which also means that you need to constantly track and groom and ensure that your models are constantly kept updated. And if the performance falls below a certain threshold, you need to step in and make corrections. So awareness of things like data readiness and model tracking
Right.
still needs a lot of work, and I think that's a place where HRNS can step in and help create that structure for driving machine learning effectiveness. And other areas also involve a good level of HR tech engagement. One is network analytics, right, where uh, areas like graph data science can really help organizations drive change sustainably. And we felt that this is one place again where HRNS can help, because at this point in time, most organizations look at themselves as one large monolith, right? They look at employee engagement as one large activity, whereas actually the fact remains that an organization is a collection of informal networks, right? The networks could be aligned by location or by departments. So aligning change management through these informal networks is something that can really help organizations drive change, right? So these are some of the areas which I felt that organizations can really use, and that's what I'm focusing on these days.
Right. And I think that also, in a broad sense, gives us an idea of the HRness ecosystem, right?
Right, absolutely.
So that ways, so there is definitely, I heard about, network analytics, and we've discussed the details of those in our earlier conversations. And I have few, points that I want you to cover. So we'll get into that in a moment. But I think your inputs around machine learning and the AI models, right? I think I also feel that these awareness and the readiness, the realization of that kicks in uh, at a stage when they've probably engaged a partner or got into some initiative, hit a
Absolutely.
roadblock, right? And that's where they start feeling we were not ready, right? And then that entire initiative takes such a long time that either they lose interest, or they also lose the entire initiative, or the or all the
Right,
fizzles out, right?
right.
So these readiness and these foundational elements are equally important, right, for us to get
Correct.
started, right, is what I hear. But anything else in terms of the overall HRness ecosystem that you want to cover?
Yeah. What you hit and what you just said now hits the nail on the head, right? Some foundational elements are required to be in place, and for that to happen, you don't need any technical intervention. It's more functional expertise that talking about, and there's enough of that in the organization. What
Right,
is really required is that functional expertise is then has to be to a certain extent guided by some of the machine learning folks, so who can sort of guide the team, saying that, okay,
right,
typically we would need this kind of data, so can you please put that in place before we start the process, right? And that's just the beginning of the journey. Towards the end of the journey, when you're launching the program, right, you also need to have the maturity to, or rather the technical expertise to decide, hey, what are the metrics I will track to
yeah,
ensure that the model continues to be effective, right? And what are the red flags I want to raise when the threshold goes below a certain limit? So we need to keep that in mind as well.
right, right. Great. So moving on to my, one of the things that I typically learn from you on the network analytics, that was an area which, I got introduced through our conversations a couple of years back.
Right.
But then, we've seen that, I'm sure, evolving, right? And the concepts of, influencer identification in organizations. And like you mentioned, that many of these are interconnected, networks, informal networks in organizations. So how do you see those concepts of network analysis, analytics, and influencer identification coming up or shaping up in organizations?
Right. So I think that phrase you used, which is influencer analysis, fortunately resonates well because primarily outside the work, right? We hear that term a lot, especially the younger population, which is the Instagram
Right.
generation, right? There's a lot of influencer activity that happens over there. So
Correct.
people are fortunately able to relate to that concept, right?
Mhm.
So that way, selling the concept to organizations is not that difficult.
Right.
What's interesting these days is to navigate the regulatory challenges around executing a strategy like this, right? So if you go to a HR leader and say that, hey, I can help you leverage influencers in your enterprise to
Yeah.
drive change. There's a lot of excitement, but when
Right.
we start getting into the data collection, some I would not say issues, but some points that come up is what kind of data can we look at to
Mhm.
create this network, right? And but the fact remains that it is possible to do influencer analysis without really compromising on privacy
Right.
um, issues. So, for example, earlier organizations had issue with influencer analysis because there was a request to look at conversations happening on enterprise social platforms, right? But there is a workaround for that as well, right? So you can look at that conversational data and anonymize it very effectively so that
Yeah.
you're looking only at the aggregate data.
Right.
And the other is, you also have the option of looking at data points other than conversations. And that is what's typically called active ONA,
Right.
where instead of looking at conversations, you administer surveys right? So the survey question is something along the lines of, who are the 4 people who you reach out to for mentorship, right? And if you administer that question to everybody in your organization, you get a fairly mature graph that reflects to the level of mentorship in your organization. Right? And by changing the question of the survey, you get a different type of graph,
Correct.
right? So while intuitively leaders understand influence in the initial phases of an implementation, they might get a little antsy about sharing data, but there are ways of getting around that by anonymizing data using active ONA, where you can still generate influence related data to drive organizational change, right? And influence analytics is just one part. There's a lot of other type of analytics that can be used for better change management. So one example is cluster analysis, right? This is something that even banks are using these days for use cases like credit card frauds, right? So in cluster analysis, exactly like you mentioned earlier, Abhi, right? Uh, Practically speaking, organizations are all a collection of informal networks, right? So using techniques like cluster analysis, you can identify those islands inside the organization where people very organically collate, right? Some people might collate by areas of expertise, some might collate by departments. And instead of identifying overall influences, if you identify few influences within each of these clusters, that drives change a lot more organically. Right. So cluster and again, this is not a new field. It's been around for a while. So there are a lot of open source frameworks that are available. So it's an exciting place to be where people, especially people operations leaders, can drive change effectively for a fraction of the effort.
Right. Yeah. 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 And the framing of the question, I think, brings me to the point that organizations continue to do these either one time or ongoing or in some frequency, the employee satisfaction surveys, the employee engagement surveys. They also try to determine the ENPS, which is typically, let's say, an employee net promoter score, right? But so I'm sure, using these concepts, right, to understand sentiments or the engagement levels is definitely an area where HR as a function should evolve or has evolved, or so. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. So NPS as a concept has been around for a long time. It's not just HR that uses it. It's to a large extent the backbone of many areas like brand marketing and marketing in general, right? And fundamentally, how NPS works is depending on the response that someone gives to a question, you identify promoters and you identify detractors. And depending on how the overall promotion level is, you get an NPS score, right? So if the number of promoters is significantly more than number of detractors, your NPS score is high. So while that's a very useful concept, what does help, what we can do is to take NPS along with influencer analytics, where we don't assume that everybody's opinions are equal, right? For want of a better word, right? I know that's a sensitive comment to make, but depending on how much of an influencer somebody is in an organization, how detractive or how promotional they are can have a higher impact, right? So if I'm an individual who doesn't interact with anybody, it doesn't matter if I'm a detractor, right? But if I'm someone who's highly connected, who everyone looks up to for mentorship or who's a subject matter expert, if I say something negative, it significantly ripples across the organization, right? So one probable way of using the NPS is to sort of overlay the influence data on top of the scores, so that instead of just giving one monolithic NPS score, we can sort of give a weighted score, right? So people who are influencers, their detraction or promotion scores will be bumped up a little more, right? As opposed to people who are on the outskirts, right? Because that will give you a much more better and realistic representation of what is going to happen if one specific group of people start talking positively or negatively, right? So there's a interesting firm called Oglens that's doing some work in this space. So they have a metric called ONPS, so the Oglens NPS, So
Right.
there they do an NPS survey, but in the output of the survey, for every NPS score, they give a weighted score as well. So it's a more representative idea of how the organization is being promoted.
Great, great. Yeah, I think very interesting. And when I had heard about this, the network analytics and all of these from you, I think definitely, that stayed back with me for more than a year. So I think, but yeah, I think hopefully organizations will start utilizing the benefits of these, right, to really determine
Absolutely. Fingers crossed.
and the outcomes that the people leaders can leverage.
Right.
Now I think the shifting slight gears, but staying in the overall HRness ecosystem, is the other most important and widely talked about, AI and HR, talent and AI and all of these, right? But let's say in general, if you look at the HR practices, to what extent do you see organizations using AI and maybe if they are skewed in some of the functional areas or kind of being used across? I think, can you share some thoughts or your observations on that?
Right. So my sense of AI in HR, based on my interaction with a couple of HR leaders, is that in general, the level of adoption of AI in HR is not as much as we would want in
Right.
other parts of the organization. Right? And there are many reasons for it, and the reasons vary depending on the context of the organization. Right? In some cases, what we were discussing earlier, the fundamental building blocks of adequate data are missing, right? In some cases, and more often than not, there isn't enough of a in-house expertise to be able to ask really tough questions
Right.
when, say, someone is selling an AI platform to the organization. Right?
No.
So when I say tough questions, I mean something like, okay, what are the metrics that you have? If I'm speaking to a vendor, if I'm an HR leader and I'm speaking to a vendor, what
Right.
are the metrics that you have to make sure that your product is working properly, right? Or internally, as an HR leader, do I have a group of folks inside my team who can keep a hawk's eye on the model performance,
Yep.
right, over a period of time once I've implemented?
Right.
And do I have a threshold to see what is a good performance?
Yep.
Do I have a governance mechanism when the threshold is crossed? What do I do? Right.
Right.
So to be able to do some of that, there is a little bit of work that HR teams need to do to build that expertise, because
Right.
that is definitely not functional expertise. It
Correct.
sort of borders on
Yep.
probably statistics and maybe a little bit of technical work.
Yep.
But and that's something that's typically not seen as HR skill set,
Correct.
right? In the future, this is something that will be absolutely unavoidable if
Yep.
you want to have a really good governance structure, right?
Right. Right.
Otherwise, what's going to happen is, if you are saying that, okay, I'm going to go use an AI platform and I don't have any sort of an AI orientation internally, we're
Right.
just going to consume whatever the vendor provides, and
Correct.
whether we like it or not.
Right.
So often what happens is, when organizations get into a relationship with an AI partner with this lack of internal bandwidth,
Yep.
they end up getting some sort of disappointment because they have some expectation and they don't get what they want, right?
Correct.
So that way, so in a nutshell, I think, like I said earlier, there's a lot of appetite in talent organization to use AI, but
Right.
that governance structure, internal governance structure, is missing in a lot of cases. And that could be because many organizations see that the skill set required for that governance structure as not being really an HR skill set. But that needs to change. Whether we
Right.
like it or not, every organization will have to build that basic level of awareness, right? So
Right.
once that's in place, or either they can build it internally or they can use some third party service providers who can provide that governance framework
Right.
to be able to track these performance of these metrics effectively. If
Right.
they use a second option, that's still also something that's available, and
Right.
probably that would be more practical, because in that case they don't need to build those skills internally, right? They can use those third party providers to track these solutions.
Right, right. But what I hear from you, Toji, also means that, in future that organizations may want to have at least some people who understand AI language, or at least, the workings, some bit of the technicalities, also understand that there has to be these matrix, governance, mechanism, all of these broadly, right? And then, you know, some subject matter expert or someone external coming and building the framework, handing it over. So I'm saying, you know, there has to be a combination of these, right, for
Absolutely.
initiatives to
Right.
be. Uh,
So absolutely. So, and let me illustrate that with a, let me step back and illustrate that with a functional framework, right? So, for any successful AI implementation, there are three broad skill sets involved. There's development skill set, there's statistical skill set, and then there's functional skill sets, right? So, usually when you engage with an AI service provider, it's usually an engineering firm,
Correct.
right? And they may not have all these three skill sets, right?
Correct.
But
Yeah.
as an end user, for you to be able to consistently track the model over a period of time,
Yeah.
if not the technical skill set, at least you need in-house statistical and functional expertise, right?
Correct.
And
Yeah.
if you don't have it, you need to create a bandwidth to create that skill set over a period of time. So you're absolutely right, Abhi. So we need that internal bandwidth in the organization. The only thing is the organizations need to be very clear inside these three skill sets. What do I want to build internally, right? I mean, if it's, I mean, one example is if you want to build an AI platform internally, then definitely you need all three, right? But if you're consuming a third party platform, then you just need the statistical and the functional background. So you're at least able to ask tough questions to make sure you're getting the bang for the buck for
Right.
the service you're consuming.
Right. This is great, but I think none of these come without the you know, and I remember you mentioning some of these I think nuances, if I can call it, or details of sometimes what is seen as an issue or a concern, right? So it could be technical, let's say a bias in an algorithm, right? Because machine learning and AI models learn through the existing
Right.
data, or how we have maintained, or organizations have maintained some of these and use those to build the future models or the frameworks, right? It could also be, you know, data privacy, and you touched upon it also briefly around the in the network analytics bit. But how do you, you know, see all of this also shaping up, or the
Right.
workaround in training models?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's a very relevant question, right? Often what happens is, people leaders very enthusiastically jump on to a AI tool because it's created a lot of buzz and they want to leverage it.
Yeah.
But for whatever reasons, including the lack of, internal bandwidth to understand these metrics, what often happens is some of these products fail for uh, mainly two reasons. One is there is a lack of understanding of the performance metrics of the model. Secondly, there is a inadequate appreciation of the bias that can creep in if the data that was used to train the model was not adequate enough, right? So let me take the second case first, the bias, right? And there's lots of literature out there these days around the concepts of bias and fairness in machine learning models, right? And I'll give a probably a very simple example, right? So if you train a resume screening model, right? And if you look at historical data, let's say the data for hiring an architect or a senior architect rather, right? And in a lot of cases, this tends to be skewed towards one specific gender, right?
Mhm.
So historically, for example, if you have hired just 10 people, right? And these 10 people have been sourced, have been based on some 1,000 profiles that have been sourced, then 100 have been shortlisted, and then some have been interviewed, right? So historically, from the 1,000, if you hired only say 9 people eventually over a couple of years, right, and you use that to train the model,
Right.
now the model for all practical purposes is going to think that women can't do this job,
Yep.
right? Because it's just historical bias,
Yeah.
right? So you can't really blame the model if it then gives a biased shortlisting every time you ask for it, right?
Right.
So what is required over there for that in-house talent to then come in and say, hey, wait a minute, this looks biased.
Mhm.
I'm not going to trash your product, but I'm just curious, what's the kind of training data that you used, right?
Right.
And when you ask questions like that, you realize that the training data is skewed, right?
Right.
So that's a problem statement. And it's not that there is no solution. There are frameworks out there where you can take care of situations like this by creating synthetic data, so
Right.
that even if only 5% of the training data is female profiles, you can create additional synthetic data so that the
Right.
distribution is a little more balanced. So there are ways around doing that, right? But the problem is we need to acknowledge that bias and fairness is an issue. We
Right.
need to figure out how to identify when there's an issue, and we need to figure out how to give a solution. That's point number one. Point number two is, when it comes to the data adequacy. I know that was not part of the question, but there is a lot of attention that needs to be paid. So, irrespective of which industry you're in, you need to be aware of what are some of the key metrics that are used in that industry, right?
Right.
And you need to ensure that the model that has been trained
Right.
uses all these data points while doing those predictions,
Right.
right? And point number three is, if even if you look outside the data adequacy and the bias, there's the third element, and this is what you were referring to as well, Abhi, the privacy bit, right?
Right.
Depending on the geographies that you're operating in, some of the privacy regulations can be significantly strict,
Yeah.
right? So, for example, something like a GDPR,
Yeah.
a violation of a GDPR can have penalties as much as 4% of the global revenue, right? So the what organizations also need to do is figure out what are the boundary lines, right? And the boundary lines don't have to be restrictive. There are ways of getting around that. So the
Right.
same synthetic data example that I said, using that you can create data that is statistically representative of the organization but still doesn't compromise the privacy guidelines,
Right.
right? So
Right.
while these are all problem areas that exist, these are all problems which to a large extent have been solved, right? We
Right.
just need to be aware of those frameworks so you can use them to solve for privacy, for bias and fairness, and a lack of data in general.
Right. Right. So that's, I think, there's a lot of the, awareness, the foundational elements and solutions or workarounds that have, been worked out. I think it's putting all of these together, right, is what, makes sense for our organizations to consume. So before they get
Absolutely.
on any of these, either AI or
Right.
analytics or these pieces, right?
And if I may add one more point, sorry. So far, whatever we've discussed is about what happens till the point where the model is created, right? And probably from a tracking perspective.
Right.
But in additional area, a lot of organizations are probably missing these days is the entire concept of a human in the loop,
Mhm.
right? So
Right.
what often happens is that there's a lot of pushback from regulatory agencies saying that, hey, you can't use an AI because then an AI is making some important decisions as to whether this profile should be shortlisted, right?
Right.
Or whether this person should be paid this much compensation, right? That's the issue that regulatory authorities have with frameworks like this.
Right.
But a relatively simple and robust solution to this is use AI, but as a tool, as a recommendation tool,
Right.
and not as a prescriptive workflow, right? So, simple example is a sourcing workflow. We can look at the ranking of the platform,
Correct.
but it doesn't shouldn't be the case that the ranking directly feeds into the interview process. The recruiter still gets involved. The
Right.
recruiter can still overlook the ranking and maybe look at someone who is a lower fit because they felt intuitively we
Right.
need, like the example that I said, the senior architect, right?
Yep. Yep.
Now, a female profile might be shown as a 60% fit, which is a
Right.
relatively small fit, but
Yeah.
the recruiter can figure out that everything else matches.
Right.
She has the skills, she has the experience, but for some reason the rating is low. So let me just overlook this.
Yep.
So as long as that human in the loop element is present, we
Correct.
should still be able to overlook some of the regulatory pushback
Right.
on AI tools, right? And just to extend the argument, right, that human in the loop doesn't have to be limited to validating the input. It's also a very useful element for creating training data.
Right. Yep.
So, for example, if you have a corpus of 1,000 profiles on which the original training was done, and
Yep.
if you feel that the performance has crossed a threshold,
Right.
at some point retraining is required, right?
Correct.
So there, this bandwidth that you've created for human intervention can be used for creating new data. right?
Right.
Either you can create it as an organization, or you can use some third-party service providers who have who do this as a business model, where they label data or they label files which you can use to train your information, right? And to a large extent, this is even being used for LLM models, right? Where prompt engineering is being used to tweak
Right.
stock LLMs before they're implemented into a enterprise ecosystem.
Right. Right. Great. I think that was quite a lot. But then how does HRness kind of come in? We heard about the HRness ecosystem you mentioned at the beginning, but then what kind of, let's say, support or solutions have you been providing, let's say, either in the AI journey or HR as a function, network analytics,
Right.
all of these, right? Largely, let's say AI is the
Right.
prime, right?
Yeah.
Either it could be these people initiatives which go beyond the HR as a function. So HR many times is the custodian, or let's say the operationalizing, some of these initiatives. But there could be some
Right.
of these also within the functional boundaries of HR, right? So meant for the HR folks or for the larger organization. So anything you want?
Right. So the way HRNS is looking at contributing value, especially when it comes to the implementation of AI in HR, is to at a very simplistic level to address the fact that there is a lot of appetite in talent operations teams to use AI,
Right.
but there may or may not be bandwidth internally to be able to engage with AI effectively and get the best bang for the buck, right?
Right.
And the
Right.
first step towards that in that direction is assuming the organization is in the early stages of maybe developing an AI tool internally or engaging with an AI service provider, just to do that audit of the data adequacy, right? We can come in and work with HR organizations to see how ready are you to provide training data that can be used to
Right.
prepare your models, right?
Right. Yeah.
Now, assuming the model has been created and it is in production, but organizations feel that something is not right, right? I'm not able to get either good accuracy or I'm not satisfied with the outputs. That's where probably HRNS can play a significant role, because internally we have the statistical and the functional background to
Right.
be able to take any machine learning model, be it a classification model or a regression model,
Right.
and to understand all the different metrics and play it back to the HR leader in a way that
Right.
is functionally oriented. It will not be a lot of technical gobbledygook, but
Right.
we would take metrics like, fairly technical metrics like false positive, false negative, sensitivity, etc., and
Right.
explain that to talent leaders, saying that your model is not working because this metric seems to suggest that you're getting a lot of, for example, in the case of candidate authentication, right? In this case, you're getting a lot of unnecessary candidate rejections.
Right.
In this case, you're getting a lot of unnecessary candidate acceptances, right? Where one is a brand impact, the other is an operational impact, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
where we really feel we can add value is to help leaders understand the metrics around machine learning model in plain English, right?
Right.
Because then now they are in a position to step in and do corrective action, right?
Right.
Otherwise, depending on your service provider to give those metrics sort of goes against that maker checker model, because there's no incentive for the service provider to be really objective in
Right.
how they measure themselves. So that's the second point. The third point is providing the human in the loop services, right? So in a lot of cases, at the end of the day, when you want to measure a model, you're measuring the predicted data versus the actual data.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you're running a really large scale operation, right, and for example, you want to do candidate authentication, and say you're doing, say, 10,000 interviews in a month, right? It's not obviously possible to get the actual, authentication output. You have to sample it,
Yeah.
right? So first you have to do a statistical sampling to get a significant sample.
Right.
And secondly, for that sample data, you have to actually look at the video and say, this was an actual genuine, this was an actual fake.
Yeah.
And you use that audit to then compare with the prediction, right?
Yeah.
So that requires an intervention to firstly do that statistical sample generation, do the actual identification, and then do the mapping. So
Right.
that's a fairly labor intensive process. Some organizations may have an audit team, but some may not.
Correct.
So that human in the loop element is also something that HRNS provides. But overall, I think I strongly believe that there's a there's a whole lot of difference AI can make to talent operations.
Right.
But we just need to have the right kind of we need to ask the right kind of questions
Right.
to the service providers to be able to leverage it effectively. Right.
Right.
So that's AI in HR bit. On the network analytics, here again, I mean in one line, the key value proposition over here is the entire power of informal networks, right? The real organizations rarely work in the form of a structured hierarchy, right? There are informal groups. I think the key value proposition that HRNS can offer is to, one, help you identify those informal groups, and secondly, help you identify the influencers within those informal groups who can quickly drive change
Right.
at a lot less effort from the HR team.
Yeah. Yeah. So great. So I think we're at the end of the conversation that I think I had planned. But then I think I heard or I remember from one of our earlier conversations that some of these awareness, let's say modules on what all should the HR functional teams or HR, large HR organizations should be aware of, are some of these modules also that HRness and is working on, right? To create the awareness. One is to maybe come in and do the interventions or support. But I think is awareness modules or maybe a quick learning module, which could be kind of converted to a certification at some point and all, are also important, right? Because I think one is definitely doing it well, another is knowing so that organizations get into that preparedness. And we discussed
Absolutely.
about their internal capability or getting someone from outside. But I think that's also an area where HRness wants to work or is working on, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head, right? So even if an organization is using someone like HRness to be able to validate their AI investments,
right?
Ideally speaking, a certain amount of skill set is required internally, right? So the idea is even if you're getting a lot of data on how these models are performing, even if HRness is giving you a lot of data, you would need to be able to interpret that data. And like I said earlier, a lot of organizations don't see this as an HR skill. That needs to change, right? So to be able to develop that internal skill set, I think it is critical for HRness to be able to help its clients do that. And like you said, we are working towards creating that content and creating that structure so that there is a proper training and certification process. So organizations know that, okay, anyone who's been through this process can really help my organization have a quality conversation with AI service providers. So that to my mind is not just a good to have, but it's absolutely critical to build minimum bandwidth with our customers to be able to interpret AI and the metrics around AI performance.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for that, Toji. I think that pretty much sums up what I think I had in mind to cover. But any last closing comments from your end?
Nothing in specific, but just to reiterate, I mean, I'm passionate about the fact that the talent operations need to use AI a lot more than they're using right now. And the way all industries are evolving, eventually all industries are going to become software industries, right? Because it's going to be software everywhere. And at the end of the day, for building and running good software, you need good talent. Whether we like it or not, sooner or later, every organization will reach a point where you are an organization where your main asset walks out of the door every day. Right? So if that's the case, you need to ensure that you have good, solid frameworks in place, AI-enabled frameworks to engage that asset that's walking out of the door every day. Right? So I think I'd love to work with organizations to make sure that they are able to use AI effectively to keep people engaged and to help them perform at their top level.
Great. Thanks, Toji. Thanks for your time.
Sure. Thanks, Abhi. Have a great day. See ya.
Same to you.